Arthur Sinodinos, do you agree that parliamentary standards are the worst they've been in 14 years?
I've been around since the late 80s, and there have been lots of episodes over the years where you've seen some pretty tawdry parliamentary standards. So I think we should stand back a bit from the heat of the last few weeks, and if we want to do so, put it in historical perspective. I can remember when Paul Keating said he would make John Howard wear his leadership like a crown of thorns after a run-in with Wilson Tuckey over whether Keating had breached a promise to marry a certain young lady. I mean, you know, we can go back, and there are all sorts of examples over a very long period. We're in the heat of this at the moment, this particular saga, the Thompson saga, and the slipper twist to that. And so people, Anna Bourke is entitled to her view, but look, if I look at this with a bit more of a historical perspective, this is Parliament. This is what happens. It's a clash. And people like Albanese and others love the clash. They love the fight. There are people on our side, you know, who are well versed in these matters. And so, yeah, you will get heat in the midst of battle.
So you're proud of this profession you've just joined?
Politicians are there to serve the public, and we are ultimately the representatives of Australian democracy. So in that sense, of course, I'm proud of the profession I joined. If you're saying, am I proud of the behaviour that sometimes occurs? Of course not. But the only thing I can do and other politicians can do is try in our own way to exemplify good behaviour to the rest of the community.
Arthur Sinodinos, do you agree with Colin Barnett, who says it's time for Tony Abbott to start showing what he stands for? Or do you agree with Richard Goyder from Wesfarmers, who says the coalition should keep its industrial relations policy secret until after it's elected?
I think the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. Tony's been rolling out quite a few policies, but he's been doing this within a context where, you know, he's maintained the attack on the government, which is his first job as opposition leader. So he has been rolling policies out. If we go back to the beginning of the year, National Press Club, he started to roll out an even more significant list of policies, and he's always made the point that the policies we took to the last election remain our policies until such time as we change them in the run-up to the next election.
But he's not saying that on industrial relations. He has foreshadowed changes. Are you going to keep them secret until after you're elected into government, or will you tell the public before?
Yes, he has foreshadowed changes to industrial relations, and he will put those out before the election, because one of the things we want to do is to create a consensus for change. Now, he's spoken about change in terms of putting the pendulum in industrial relations back towards the centre. So he's not talking about taking power out of the hands of the unions and just giving it holus bolus to the employers. He's talking about a balance in the labour market. I don't think we should be taking the political advice of industry on this. You've got to take people with you, and plus, you know, people who talk from the big end of town, well, you've got to remember that we also represent, as a party, not only workers and people in the outer suburbs and working families, we also represent small and medium-sized enterprises, and their industrial relation needs are different to the big end of town, and we've got to be sensitive to all of that.
What exactly do you define as the sensible middle on industrial relations when you put that into policy terms? Are we talking about ensuring that there'll be a no disadvantage test, for example?
Tony's made it clear that there will be a no disadvantage test, but subject to that, I think we've got to have a situation where companies don't feel that unions are increasingly encroaching on their management prerogatives. We saw this in the Qantas debate, for example, the extent to which the unions try and expand the number of allowable matters in industrial relations. We've also got to make sure, in relation to small and medium-sized enterprises, that unfair dismissal laws are being sort of implemented in a way that is fair to the enterprise and not just going back to the old system where you paid money for people to go away.
So you would change unfair dismissal laws?
I think that issues around unfair dismissal laws should be part of the mix when we look at our industrial relations policy. But as I said, they're matters that we would lay out before the election so everybody knows where we stand. It's not a case of trying to sneak into government and say one thing before the election and do another thing afterwards. What we have to do, given the experience particularly of this minority government, is make sure everybody understands beforehand what our promises are and what we're going to do when we get there, and then we go and we do it.
Now, John Howard said earlier in the week, Arthur Sinodinos, of course you were his Chief of Staff, that he didn't think work choices was actually what lost him the 2007 election. He believed it was simply a desire for change in the public. Do you agree with him there?
Look, a couple of issues here. One was it was a government that had been around for a long time. I think people were getting tired of us. I don't think there's any doubt about that. What Work Choices did to some extent was galvanise the union movement to put a lot of money into the Labor Party in order to try and get us out. It's a bit like the mining tax in reverse, where the miners were very upset with what had happened over the mining tax, and they put a lot of money into public campaigns. The same happened in 2007. I've no doubt that money helped to spread Labor's message even more widely than otherwise the case. But the fact is that the conditions were there for a change of government. They were sick and tired of us. They wanted to move on. And it's unfortunate that they did, because in retrospect I think we could have handled the economy better going through the GFC and facing up to potentially a second GFC.
So you don't think that Work Choices was the big mistake that cost you government?
I don't think of itself it was the big mistake, but it goes into a mix with other factors. Life, Latika, is complex. There are always a number of factors. There's never a silver bullet.
I guess where I'm getting at, Arthur, is that the public might see the coalition not having learned the mistake of Work Choices then, if you don't believe that it was a cause of your election loss in 2007.
Well, where I think the rubber hits the road is that before the election, as I said before, we make sure that our plans in this area, industrial relations as in other areas, are laid out before the public, so we have a conversation with the public and we take the public with us.
Do you think Tony Abbott has created a model of opposition that has broken new ground, and are you worried that his effectiveness will now set up a template for the future when you're in government?
Latika, I went through 11 or 12 years of the Howard government where I didn't hear much positive come out of the Labor opposition. So I take great umbrage at this idea that somehow Tony Abbott, effective as he's been as an opposition leader, has created some new model. The model's been around. The great reformer Paul Keating went into the 93 election arguing against the very reform he had championed in 1985, the goods and services tax. He did that for political reasons to beat John Hewson. So this idea that somehow negativity and sort of attacking the other side is something new and it's been perfected by Tony Abbott is, I think, a bit of an urban myth.
You don't think, though, that he's more effective than those opposition leaders, and that is the more worrying factor in terms of how to pursue, for example, a proper scare campaign in future against perhaps your policies?
Well, I can't, as a Liberal politician, say that Tony Abbott shouldn't have been as effective as he's been. He's got to be as effective as he needs to be to do the job, which is to hold the government to account and put us in a position to try and win the next election. If you're saying, does this mean that Labor in opposition would be bitter and negative? Well, hello, I've been there before. I was there from 96 and I've seen them be bitter, negative, turn their back on their own reform legacy and essentially naysay everything we tried to do in government.
Well, not everything, Arthur Sinodinos. They did, for example, agree to border protection reforms on the Tampa, and that's something that your side is now opposing, even though your policies are actually quite similar.
I was there for the Tampa stuff, and they agreed in the morning and they disagreed in the afternoon when the legislation was produced. I was there in the room with Kim Beazley when they walked away from that. I remember that very well. I think Tony Abbott has been bipartisan on issues to do with enterprise mining agreements, if we want to be very contemporary. He's been very bipartisan on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and he's been bipartisan on trying to get aged care reform going in the budget. I think he has been positive while maintaining a very effective negative attack, and if Labor people don't like that, they only have to look at the past to see where the template came from.
Arthur Sinodinos, we've seen complaints from both sides from time to time about the leaders' offices and how they handle various issues and indeed how they deal with the backbench. What does it take to be a good Chief of Staff?
Look, in the case of the Howard government, it wasn't a matter of individuals. I was part of a team. And the important thing is to have a team in an office who are relatively senior, relatively mature, have had experience in various areas, not just in, say, one particular area, and who have a capacity to not be afraid to say to a leader when they think something's going off the rails. It worked in our case because we were a team. It wasn't just one individual. I was Chief of Staff for a while and Policy Director before that, but I had some really senior, mature people around you, and you've got to work for a leader who is not afraid to have senior people around them. And Bob Hawke did the same thing in the early 80s when he had Peter Barron there and Graham Evans and Jeff Walsh and Bob Hogg. He wasn't afraid to have some pretty, individual characters around him who were prepared to tell him when they thought something was being stuffed up. And I think that is important. I think Kevin Rudd lacked that. He had some bright young things around him, but that's not the same as a bit of grey hair or even in some cases no hair.
Obviously, watching the breakdown in communications between the Prime Minister's office and her Senior Minister Chris Bowen over the Gina Rinehart foreign worker agreement, reading between the lines, what do you see there as the cause of what's happened?
I think the cause of what's happened there is that between Julia Gillard and her office, they were caught napping on this. They were given the information, apparently. They knew for a while this was all coming up. They had an opportunity to proactively manage the announcement of this and make a positive out of it, but they were caught sleepwalking. Maybe they're just punch drunk, or they're just reacting to every day's headlines and they're not thinking ahead, but they had plenty of opportunity, as I see, reading between the lines, to proactively manage the issue.
Arthur Sinodinos, thank you very much for joining us on Weekend Breakfast.
Thanks very much, Latika.